Hello, friends. This is Angel. I wanted to make a short video talking a little bit, giving an introduction really to testing, the RSpec framework, the test environment, those sorts of things, how a spec file is structured, um, just a little bit of that kind of background. So yeah, I think this is the first time that we've seen an RSpec file or a test file at all in this lesson. So I thought that might be instructive at this time. So I have open right now. I have the spec models core spec file. This is the test file that contains all of the specs for the course model that should have come with your Dream of Code application when you cloned it. So all of these things should have been included. Um, as I mentioned, we're using the RSpec framework, and I guess just to give a brief overview of what testing is, automated tests are we describe the behavior for a class or a method, or sometimes for integration tests, like a series of methods or a flow. But basically, what we're saying is when we set up the data this way, or we have this kind of scenario, we expect that when we call this method, when we execute this code, when we proceed through this flow, we expect that this thing will happen. We expect that the result will be this thing. And so that's how you should try to think about all of the tests is like, given a certain data setup, when we call some code, we expect that this thing should happen. Um, so yeah, hope that helps. Let's talk a little bit about the test environment. So first of all, you see on line 2 here, the very first thing that we're doing is requiring Rails helper. Rails helper is this file over here. And it has some kind of general configuration stuff that we won't talk too much about. But the first thing you can see that happens here in the Rails helper is that we set the Rails environment to test. And there are generally Rails frameworks come with, by default, three environments. We have a development environment, and that's the thing that we work in when we start up a Rails console, when we start up a Rails server, and um, uh, looking at localhost 3000. Um, we have a production environment, and that's what runs by default, usually if you deploy to an environment like Heroku, or if you're familiar with Node, like you might be thinking of like Vercel or any of those other platform as a service platforms. And then we have a test environment, and this is the environment. It's completely separate from development and production, and so each of these environments have their own data store as well. So locally, when you did Rails DB setup, when you first set up the project, you might have seen, I can't remember actually if it outputs in the um, in the console, but there were two databases created, one for development environment and one for test, and they're completely separate databases. So when we ran the seeds, all of the data that was created that was, initially in the spreadsheet that is now in the development database, none of that is in the test database. So when we write tests, any data setup that we need for the tests, we actually have to create in the beginning of the test. Um, yeah, and so you can see this is like a really helpful comment here. The test environment is used exclusively to run your application's test suite. You never need to work with it otherwise. And remember that it's wiped and recreated between test runs. So you don't want to rely on any data there. You can't expect it to be, um, maintained from one test to the next. But it also means that you have a clean slate. And so you don't have to worry about data being in a weird state when you start a test. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about just the structure of an RSpec file. You'll see a lot of something, something, something do, and then everything's indented. And then, another something, something do, everything's indented. Another something, something do, stuff's indented. Each of these, like do, stuff's indented, and then it ends in an end. These are all blocks. And it's just how a common way to kind of organize um, things, for a lack of a better word, in an RSpec file. So we have describe blocks. This is a main describe block that is describing the course model. We're defining this type of test as a model test or a model spec. And there's other kinds of specs. We have request specs, other kinds of specs. And we have another describe block here. Um, this bit here is just a name that we give it, but there are some conventions to this name. So we'll start a describe block for every kind of group of behaviors or group of tests for a specific method. We usually have one describe block if we're for each method, but then there's like a group of behaviors like validations where we would group all of those tests into one describe block. And so we just name it something sensible if it's like validations, but if it's for the method, we definitely just name the describe block with the method name. And the rule is that you prefix the method name with a dot if it's an instance method, or if this was a class method, you would prefix it with a hash. You don't have to remember that, just for your info. Excuse me. Okay, so yeah, we have a describe method for each um, for each group of behaviors or each method. And then inside the describe block, we'll have either an it block, so starting with it, do, end, some stuff, or a context, do, end. Um, an it block, these are the actual tests. Uh, so inside of an it block, you might see a whole bunch of other stuff in here if there's some data setup to do inside the test or something like that. But you should always see an expect. This is the sort of the meat of the test, right? This is we expect the results of the thing inside expect to be, and then whatever comes after that. Excuse me. This one's a bit more clear. So expect when we call an instance of a course dot student name list, we expect it to equal empty array. So every it block is the actual test. A context is a grouping. And we usually use a context to group like data scenarios or like data setups. Or we would separate things into context when the data scenarios are different. So this will make more sense as we read the titles of these contexts. So this one says when there are no students enrolled in the course, and on line 63 we have when there are students enrolled in the course. So you can see those are just two different data setup scenarios. And so we would split the tests according to those data setup scenarios so that we can do any necessary data setup within that context, and it applies to all of the tests in that grouping. So for this one, when there are no students enrolled for the course, we don't have to do anything extra because we don't have to create any students and enroll them or anything like that. But for this data setup, when there are students enrolled in the course, we do have extra data to set up. And so that brings us to these let statements. This is a way in RSpec of setting up variables. So when you see let, and then we have this, we're defining this symbol here. This is actually defining the variable called enrolled student 1, which you can see used here on line 87, and enrolled student 2, which you can see on line 88. And it's just a common way of setting up variables in RSpec to uh, keep it clean and tidy, for one. And also, I think there is some memoization that is done, or basically it just saves a little bit on performance. Tests can be one of those areas where you think maybe a little more about performance at some point because you're often running your full test suite and um, gating deployment on the run of the test suite. So at some point, once the application becomes, larger, you might be thinking more about how can I make my test more performant. Just an FYI. So anyway, yeah, so these let statements define some variables. And when you see a bang after the let, that means don't be lazy about it. Just go ahead and define it before the test starts. When you see no bang after the let, it means only define this when we get to a point in the test where that variable is called. Um, these bangs don't actually need to be here, but we won't get into that right now um, because they are used right here in this before. Okay, so we've created these students here, or we've defined these variables for these two students. Now we have a before block. This is another thing, do, end. So this is just a block that will execute any code that comes in this context after the before block. So before all of the tests, or before any tests in this context that's defined on line 63, we execute this code. And these are just creating new enrollments where the student for the enrollment is the ones that we've defined up here, and the course that for the enrollment is the course that we've been using in this whole file, which is defined up here on line 25 in this let. And so we've defined the trimester and the coding class as well up here. And so this data that we've defined between 13 and 27, 28, as it mentions up here, this data setup is used for all of the tests in the file. And so that's another thing to keep in mind is that is the scoping of the variables or the data setup. It might be intuitive, but like anything that's like further indented um, is going to have these variables in scope. But if we we've defined a variable here, obviously that's not going to be in scope to any test outside of this test. And similarly, we have a context here. All the stuff that we're defining in this context is not available to any context at the same level or outside of this context. Okay. So yeah, where were we? We were talking about the before block here. We're setting up a couple of enrollments. Um, and then we define this variable called expected results. And we can see that we use it here on line 99. So this is a shorthand for um, what we're expecting the result of this method call to be in this data scenario. And it just keeps it tidy to define it up here and then refer to it here in the expectation. Okay, so I think that hopefully that helps um, give you a little context about RSpec and about the test environment. I think I'll make another video where we walk through doing some test-driven development, and we let the test defined here in the student name list describe block kind of guide our development. So I will see you then.